In China alone, 10 million people died. In Indonesia, 4 million. Japan lost 2.5 million. The United States lost 100,000. Australia and New Zealand, 40,000. The bloodshed unleashed great change. It made the United States the first superpower, a military and industrial giant. In 1945, 2,000 American planes flew over the Japanese surrender. American factories made that many in a week. In Asia, the old order was gone forever. Within 5 years, China, a quarter of the world's population, would be communist. And in the name of anti-communism, Americans would march to 2 more Pacific Wars and build a military framework which lasts to this day. For Japan, economic ambition replaced military ambition. This is a Japanese business school. It is a remedial college for failing managers. Japan does not accept failure. Japan lost its war. But in today's world, the biggest company, the richest bank, the largest stockbroker are all Japanese. Japan is now history's biggest creditor, while its old conqueror, America, has become history's biggest debtor. This is a series about these great shifts of power in the Pacific. The Pacific is the American lake. American power dominates the Pacific Basin, a third of the world's surface area. The United States Pacific Command includes 380,000 troops. It operates dozens of bases, camps, and command posts. U.S. military allies flank the ocean. Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, the Micronesian Islands, and Australia form a great crescent, the western ramparts of Fortress America. America's security net includes the fastest growing economies on Earth and the world's biggest trade flow. In all, 2 billion people live around the Pacific Basin. Since Marco Polo, Europeans have responded to the masses of Asia, both with optimism and with fear. American power, too, has wavered between encouraging and containing the energies of the East. Americans dreamt of a Pacific destiny before the turn of the century. By the 1840s, settlers reached the California coast and looked out to the sea. In 1893, the expansionist senator Orville Tate proclaimed, "It is to the ocean our children must look as once they looked to the boundless West." The lure was not the ocean itself. It was China. China occupies a special place in the American heart. America's destiny in the Pacific is, in large part, the story of a tumultuous affair with China.
I'm going to recite to you the Hail Mary in Chinese. In
the 19th century, China became a crusade to Christian America. This film celebrates Catholic missionaries.
The clouds in the west are blood-tinged, as though a chalice poured its crimson across the sky. Perhaps the young priest prays for red martyrdom.
But China enticed Protestant missionaries too. All denominations set off to spread the gospel among 400 million lost souls. Congregations at home learned to love China through the Sunday morning sermon.
These men, like galley slaves of old, struggle under a yoke, pulling their very hearts out. But they carry a yoke far more terrible, which we do not see. They carry the yoke of Satan, for they are pagan. And this is the yoke which we must live.
A young missionary doctor, Walter Judd, heard the call in 1925.
I used to always illustration, here's Asia like a giant hand, China's the palm of the hand. And here are 16 countries coming out of it, from Korea clear around to Afghanistan. It borders on China. Well, when you have, at that time, 400 million people, half the people of Asia in that hub of the Asian wheel, that's the key.
China was the Lord's largest vineyard, and all of them were working away at winning the Chinese souls. This translated back into general American public interest in China, and that then was led to an obsession and a feeling that the United States had a special role in China.
There was more to China than souls. The European powers operated lucrative trading concessions in China. The port of Shanghai still bears the architectural stamp of the British, French, and Germans. They carved the city into spheres of influence, which were colonies in all but name. In 1911, Chinese nationalists ousted the imperial system, opposing European exploitation. Americans felt they understood this new democratic generation.
Here was a latent force which could be harnessed to the task of making China once again a nation great in its own right, and free of the foreign domination which had kept its masses enslaved in immemorial drudgery.
American business also saw China's great potential.
Gentlemen, these are the last words I will address to you. Attend them well and remember them long. The company is sending you out to China to dispel the darkness of centuries with the light of a new era. Oil for the lamps of China, gentlemen. American oil.
America advocated an open-door policy which would break up European cartels and open a vast market. The vaunted China trade was always an illusion. It never grew beyond 2% of U.S. export receipts. America gained a foothold in Asia with the conquest of the Philippines, but influence in China remained insignificant. Then in 1927, an army general named Chiang Kai-shek consolidated leadership of China's ruling Nationalist Party.
Around Chiang Kai-shek today are grouped the ablest statesmen and the most capable military leaders that China has ever known.
A Christian, Chiang Kai-shek seemed to embody American aspirations and ideals. By 1935, his armies had driven China's growing communist movement into exile in the north. But Chiang's problems multiplied. In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army invaded China. Japan had fallen under the influence of militarists who vowed to build an empire throughout all Asia and the Pacific. The Japanese were even more brutal than the old colonial masters.
Most intensively bombed spot in all the world is the wartime capital of free China, the 4,000-year-old city of Chongqing. Situated deep in the mountains of Asia, almost 1,500 miles up the Yangtze River from Shanghai.
Chiang resisted the Japanese and set up a wartime capital in southern China. To Americans, his heroism was confirmed. In 1941, Japan, hoping to drive all European powers and the United States from Asia, attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Propaganda reenactments of the daring raid played in Japanese theaters. America would enter the war with equal force.
This is America. America, where we make war with machines, power, sweat. America, where we make justice. Justice for the soldiers of Japan who tossed Chinese babies on their bayonets. Justice for the soldiers of Japan.
President Roosevelt developed an alliance with Chiang Kai-shek and sent a military mission to China. Chiang became the centerpiece of Roosevelt's hopes for post-war Asia. John Peyton Davies was a Foreign Service diplomat assigned to the U.S. Army in China. His memos went back to Roosevelt.
He was thinking in terms of a great power quadrangle of Stalin, Churchill, himself, and Chiang Kai-shek, because he had to have an Oriental in there. And so, therefore, he was tied to the person of Chiang, which this happens again and again in American diplomacy, of undue attachment to the head of state, notwithstanding all the indications of things going wrong underneath him.
Much did go wrong. In 1942, it was thought Chiang's armies would be part of a final Allied assault on Japan, launched from China. But Americans became disillusioned with poor morale in Chiang's army and corruption in his government.
Chiang knew that it was corrupt. And as Madame Chiang said to General Chennault, the American air commander, if we know that these people are no good around the General Chennault. If we are to get rid of all of them, where will we be? We have nobody else. So he was a captive. The Generalissimo himself, who, as a good Methodist, was presumably incorrupt himself, was surrounded by corruption and operated through it.
In 1944, seeking contact with Chiang's rivals, the Americans sent a fact-finding mission to Yan'an in the north. There, Chinese communists were fighting a successful guerrilla war against the Japanese. They had declared an uneasy truce with Chiang, but their long-term objective was control of all China. Chinese-speaking diplomat John Service flew to Yan'an and was given long audiences with Mao Zedong and the communist leadership.
They were going to win, and this is the thing that was so surprising, that they were absolutely determined that they were on the winning side, not against Japan, but in internal terms against the Kuomintang, that future China was theirs. And we were sort of bowled over by this, because they seemed from us on the outside to have been a rather small party, controlling fairly large areas, but still a minor part of China. And here they knew that they were on a winning track.
Meanwhile, the U.S. and its allies stormed island after island, setting the foundation for post-war American power in the Pacific. As Japan's empire crumbled, it became clear that the Chinese battlefield would not decide the war. More Americans visited Yan'an, but the likelihood grew of civil war between the communists and the nationalists. Communist leaders said they wanted continued contact with America. Foreign service officers endorsed the request.
We thought that a civil war would bring Russia into control in China. And the argument we tried to make was that the Chinese communists were Chinese more than Russian, that unless forced to rely on Russia, they did not want to become a Russian satellite, and that there was a basis for cooperation. But of course, in 1945, 46, trying to sell this attitude that they were Chinese more than communists and so on was hopeless. I mean, people thought we were loonies, or out of our heads. Everybody knew that communist was a communist was a communist.
Our stake in the future is tied up inextricably with this titanic struggle between communism and democracy.
Foreign policy decisions on China were not made in the field. They were made in Washington. In the capital, priorities had changed. The war against Japan was won. Post-war propaganda proclaimed a new sense of destiny.
It was this desire for freedom, common to all races, which established democracy in our own country. In the long pull, it can be counted upon to fling off the tyrannies that crush human independence all over the world.
President Truman and advisors such as Clark Clifford pledged America to worldwide anti-communism.
Really, the only way we could do it in China was to align ourselves with Chiang Kai-shek. Now, as time went on, we found him to be highly ineffective. We found his administration to be affected by corruption, by weakness, by lack of leadership. And yet, we had to go along with him because we had nobody else through whom we could work.
Shanghai, port of embarkation for more American dependents leaving for home. Due to the dangerous military and political situation in China's civil war, all non-essential American citizens have been advised to leave. 870 evacuees.
Between 1945 and 1949, the United States spent $3 billion in aid to prop up Zheng in a resurgent war against the communists.
Today, with the nationalist armies admittedly a disastrous failure, America debates a new course in the most difficult area of its foreign policy, China and the entire Orient.
In October 1949, Mao Zedong's troops entered Beijing. The People's Republic of China was born. Chiang Kai-shek retreated to the offshore island of Taiwan. The China in which Americans had invested so much was gone. The Western world was told that Stalin was now the master, not only of Eastern Europe, but of China.
In Manchuria, the Soviet army came as deliverers after the U.S. had beaten Japan. Deliverers indeed. They delivered everything they could lay their hands on to their Kremlin masters. Then they sent the Chinese Reds against their brothers with arms captured from the Japanese. A campaign that has now brought all of China's millions under the Kremlin yoke.
In America, the Republican Party blamed the Democrats for communist gains abroad.
It is their policy which has produced this tremendous threat from Soviet Russia today. And it is that communist threat which forces us to postpone today every program for domestic improvement and turn ourselves into a military state.
every kind of effort to establish a relationship with Mao and the new administration in China brought you into a position where you were criticized as being soft on communism. So I thought it was absurd, I thought it was unreal, I thought it was impractical, but that's what we went through in that period.
From inside the Kremlin in Moscow come films of the recent signing of the Chinese-Soviet treaty.
5 months after his victory, Mao Zedong traveled to the Soviet Union. America had cut diplomatic ties with mainland China. Mao denounced American policy and made a friendship pact with Stalin.
Thus, in formal ceremony, China moves further under Soviet control.
Any chance of better Sino-American relations was abandoned later that year.
Korea, the little nation that was divided at the 38th parallel to placate Russia, becoming the scene of a new communist crime against humanity.
North Korea, apparently with Stalin's approval, had pushed into South Korea, misjudging American resolve. Although China's involvement in the invasion plans was minimal, the West saw communist expansionism on the move.
Captured Russian equipment is increasingly in evidence. Russian scout cars. These are Russian-made tanks knocked out on 9 July. Testimony to the excellent equipment the North Koreans have.
The United Nations, under American leadership, dispatched troops to Korea. The supreme commander was World War II hero General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur persuaded President Truman that military force could not only hold communism, but make inroads by pushing back across the original boundary at the 38th parallel. UN troops marched up the peninsula towards China. For a time, the Allies seemed to roll back communism in Korea.
Stalin among the ruins he created, but no longer a hero to these misguided puppets, becoming prisoners where the Kremlin gangsters told them they would be conquerors. Dazed dupes of the world's most sinister and callous clique of tyrants. Cat's paws for vicious communist imperialists. They are really more to be pitied than hated.
But it was China, not the Soviet Union, which was alarmed by advancing United Nations troops.
The Korean War, particularly the Chinese involvement, came largely because of misunderstanding between the two of us and lack of any context. The Chinese tried to warn us, but they tried to warn us to an Indian diplomat who we didn't trust because we thought he was pro-Chinese and so on. The people who had experience in China were not called in.
UN troops were forced into retreat as China entered the war.
Outnumbered more than 2 to 1 by Chinese and North Koreans, the UN forces hope to regroup and to meet the overwhelming attack which has broken their fluid lines of defense across northern Korea. The president has stated that the use of the atomic bomb is being considered to halt the communist onrush inspired by Russia.
We're at war with the communist half of the world. That war wasn't started by us. It can't be ended by us except by ultimate victory.
Senator Joseph McCarthy was the leader of a group who claimed Korea was the outcome of American weakness and of communist influence in Washington. McCarthy targeted the State Department. He dug up the records of China service officers who had supported contact with Mao Zedong.
Do you feel that there's been any change in the State Department since you first began your attacks on communists in the State Department?
Talbot, I don't think they can change any more than a leopard can change his spots. The momentum of their past acts, I believe, carries them onward. I think you can perhaps best describe them in the words that Shakespeare put in the mouth of Macbeth when he said, I am in blood. Stepped in so far that to wade no more is as tedious as go on.
The former missionary, Walter Judd, a staunch supporter of Jiang, had returned to America. He won a seat in the House of Representatives and joined McCarthy in claiming the State Department had betrayed the nationalists.
The hard-boiled person who didn't understand the Chinese people, the fellow in the State Department, he looked at it, these guys aren't got a chance. This team can't ever win. This team can't win. So we got to support the winning team. But they were wrong. And furthermore, there were an awful lot of people, the communists had infiltrated much of our government.
Senator McCarthy spearheaded the attack on the State Department.
Larson then goes on to describe John Stewart Service, John P. Davies, Jr., and John Carter Vincent as the pro-Soviet group in the China section. Again, we have a known associate and collaborator with communists and pro-communists, a man high in the State Department, consorting with admitted espionage agents. And I wish to
The China service officers each faced numerous loyalty hearings.
The Truman administration was under very strong attack, not only on the communist issue, but on the China issue. So they changed the standards, so we'd have to have hearings, and then new hearings, and then there'd be new evidence. And this went on for, well over a year. And then the Loyalty Review Board, the State Department Board, finally cleared me again, officially and finally. The Loyalty Review Board then said, well, we will hear you. It gave me a one-day trial, which was a bit of a kangaroo proceedings, if you don't mind the term. And they instructed the State Department to fire me.
John Davies, who had also passed several loyalty tests, was recalled from duty when the Republicans took office.
They found me as indiscreet, essentially, lacking judgment because of my reporting that the communists were going to win and the Jiang was going to lose. And on that basis, Mr. Dulles fired me.
Davies and Service had joined a special China section of the State Department before the war. They had grown up in China, spoke Chinese, and knew China's new leaders. 20 Asia specialists joined with them. By 1952, only 2 had survived the purge.
If you have a doctor and he does the things wrong, you get another doctor. That's just as simple as that. They had been wrong.
I thought it's one of the bitterest, most unfair, most intemperate periods in American history. These were dedicated patriots. But because the far right disagreed with them, why, they attempted to make them out to be dishonest and made them out to be communist sympathizers.
When you've lost people like Jack Service and Owen Lattimore and John Peyton Davies and so on, you lost the cream of the crop who knew anything about that area. I think it weakened us as far as our future attitude toward the understanding of the Far East enormously.
While anti-communism gripped Washington, war gripped Korea for 3 grim years. Korea cemented the political boundaries of the Pacific. The Korean peninsula remained permanently divided. The U.S. stepped up its commitment to Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan as the acceptable voice of China.
The American eagle has spread its wings over Mount Fujiyama.
And increasingly, Japan became a staging area for American forces.
Ancient Japan, with her temples and pagodas, her ancestors and her gods, may indeed become the outpost of democracy in the Eastern world.
China's intervention in Korea strengthened Pacific alliances. Australian Prime Minister Robert Menzies was one of many Pacific leaders to line up with Washington. Defense treaties were also signed with Southeast Asian nations. New policies were devised to deal with the Chinese.
This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. If the reaction goes, we're in the thermonuclear era. For the sake of all of us, and for the sake of our country, I know that you join me in wishing this expedition well.
It is now 30 seconds to 0 time.
Instead of troops, the United States would deter the spread of communism with naval and air power, backed by the awesome new weapons now being tested in the Pacific.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
President Eisenhower's new policy was not just hypothetical. In 1954, the National Security Council discussed using atomic weapons in Asia on 5 separate occasions. In 1954, the French were fighting with American support to hold their colonies in Indochina.
A battle to the death is joined at Dien Bien Phu, an isolated French Union stronghold deep in communist-held territory of Indochina.
At Dien Bien Phu, French forces lured communist rebels into a decisive battle. Instead of victory, the French created a trap for themselves. The surrounding Viet Minh were poised for an overwhelming triumph. Eisenhower asked the Pentagon to draw up plans to help the French garrison. The National Security Council seriously debated one of them, Operation Vulture, a scheme to use tactical nuclear weapons against the communists. Remembering Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Eisenhower said no.
I think he felt that to use the weapons a second time in Asia would certainly give the impression that one was more casual about life in Asia than in life in Europe. And he thought that that would have a very bad effect throughout the world in terms of the appearance of a kind of racist approach to this kind of horror.
But Operation Vulture grew from a deep hostility towards China. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Radford, later said of the plan, the real purpose was to provoke a military reaction from Peking, bringing the United States and China to war before China had a chance to become strong enough to threaten U.S. interests in the future. Eisenhower restrained his military advisor.
He was a man, I think, of much more moderate approach to these things than was the case of some of the people around him, like Radford in particular.
Still, throughout the 50s, Eisenhower approved the nuclear buildup in the Pacific, the foundation of today's regional military structure. The Chinese, the people for whom Americans had a special affinity, were now nuclear targets. In Guam, B-47 nuclear bombers gave the U.S. the ability to attack cities and airfields in China. In Okinawa and Chiang Kai-shek's Taiwan, the Air Force controlled other nuclear weaponry. Again, aimed at China. The weapon systems on Navy carriers became predominantly nuclear. And with a hint of things to come, the Navy deployed 5 Regulus missile-launching submarines. By the late 50s, command and control of Pacific forces caused concern, even in the military. The Commander-in-Chief Pacific, or CINCPAC, requested a study of war plans. The RAND Corporation was brought in and assigned a young defense analyst, Daniel Ellsberg.
I may have been the only person who read the entire structure of the war planning in the Pacific, from the most general plans deriving from the Joint Chiefs of Staff plan, the JSCP, down to the CINCPAC plans, and then the individual plans for the Air Force, the Navy, individual fleets, individual air wings, and so forth, all the way down.
Ellsberg found discrepancies between various plans. He found that strategists in Washington believed war plans were flexible. But Pacific war plans assumed that war with the Soviets would include nuclear attacks on China. Pacific commanders believed they must automatically target the Chinese mainland.
They had no conception of a war that would involve only the Soviet Union and not China. As a matter of fact, if one raised that possibility, admirals or lower officers, and I did raise it, would react with just shock, amazement, puzzlement, and outrage, horror, a kind of nausea at the thought of, in the words of Vice Admiral Cavett, the commander of the 7th Fleet that I interviewed on his flagship in January of 1960, he said, you just have to believe that the people in Washington couldn't do anything that insane as to fight the Soviet Union and not take care of the real enemy, as far as CINCPAC was concerned, China.
Quemoy remains a
a crisis point. The tiny Chinese nationalist island just off the mainland has been hit by some 300,000 shells since the communist artillery barrage began August 23rd.
In 1958, for the second time in 5 years, Mao Zedong's forces began shelling the small islands of Quemoy and Matsu in the straits between mainland China and Taiwan. The shelling was widely interpreted as a prelude to an invasion of nationalist territory. The crisis indicated just how inflexible containment of China had become. The U.S. responded rapidly. The tactical initiative was left to the Pacific Forces commander, Admiral Harry Felt. Time magazine dubbed him Mr. Pacific.
I moved carriers of the 7th Fleet down into a position which the Chinese recognized was a position from which they could be hit.
Red China's reaction to the continuing stalemate and to United States peacemaking efforts is shown in these first films from the mainland since the crisis arose.
In popular newsreels, little remained of American affection for the Chinese.
Now, a patriotic rally in Beiping of truly stupendous proportions reveals the red propaganda mill is running at top tempo. The cry today is down with American aggression in the Taiwan Strait.
The question was, with what would the U.S. hit China if Mao moved across the straits?
Well, at that time, I was in the War Plans Division for the Office of Chief of Naval Operations. And we were very much concerned about the fate of Quemoy and Matsu. So we sent a message out to Admiral Felt out in Singpak. And we said that he should make some plans for a conventional attack to prevent Quemoy and Matsu from being taken over. And he sent a message right back to us in the Pentagon, and he said, sorry, I don't have any plans for a conventional attack.
Yes, we had a plan in case of war with the Chinese communists to use nuclear weapons. But I was instructed that no way will you use nuclear weapons. You will use conventional weapons.
He fired back, said, I'll make some plans, but I have only enough force in our aircraft carriers for a 1/3 of a sortie. In other words, all of our aircraft carriers in the Pacific were loaded with nuclear weapons and very, very few conventional weapons. So he couldn't make a conventional attack.
Reinforced until it ranks today as the most powerful naval force afloat, the United States 7th Fleet cruises within range of Communist China's guns.
The Quemoy crisis was a potential trigger for nuclear war during the weeks of communist shelling. Washington had no direct links to Beijing. Even communications between the Pentagon and its own forces were technically unreliable. The RAND study found that senior officers in the Pacific believed they had authority to use nuclear weapons if a crisis arose while communications were out.
Well, that was the question that everybody had in his mind. And there was no official solution to it. But the thinking, of course, was, well, maybe this person or that person or some other person not in Washington would have to take the initiative.
He, in turn, as I discovered, had delegated comparable authority to lower-level commanders, such as Commander 7th Fleet, in case communications were out with Hawaii. The fact is that in those days, prior to satellite communications, communications were out part of every day from Washington to Hawaii, and part of every day, on the average, from Hawaii to the 7th Fleet, separately. So, and frequently both. So, had communications been out, for example, during an attack by the Chinese communists on the island of Quemoy or Matsu, the admiral in charge of operations in that area would have essentially been on his own. That is, understood that he had delegated authority to use nuclear weapons. And virtually all planning at that time did call for the use of nuclear weapons.
Although Beijing eventually lifted the blockade, the Quemoy crisis proved costly for China. Alarmed by Mao's brinkmanship, Soviet leader Khrushchev reneged on a promise to give China the bomb. Quemoy hastened the onset of the Sino-Soviet split.
Now the opening statement of Senator Kennedy.
First, let me again try to correct the record on the matter of Quemoy and Matsu.
In the West, even political opponents shared a hardline view of China.
We are in a very difficult position, and therefore the President's judgment has been that we should defend the islands in his military judgment and the judgment of the commander in the field. The attack on these islands should be part of an overall attack on Formosa. I support that.
In 1960, John Kennedy campaigned, claiming to be even more anti-communist than his predecessors.
I believe in 1960 that this generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny.
But President Kennedy had new ideas about deterrence.
Three of us on President Kennedy's staff were there in the White House when he was briefed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the plan called for the use of the total nuclear force we had, should the Soviets fire one nuclear weapon. That meant China, that meant Eastern Europe, that meant incredible devastation. And President Kennedy, rather graciously, not wanting to demean the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had his three staff men leave and then told them this was totally unacceptable. He told us what he had said afterwards, and we went about getting a different plan.
The military thrust of containment would remain, but the incoming administration would find a new formula to control communism: the use of military advisors, special forces, and ground troops. They called it flexible response. The proving ground would be Vietnam. Vietnam had been partitioned in 1954, shortly after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu. In the South, to bolster what they hoped would be a Western-style anti-communist bulwark, the U.S. sent in military advisors.
Aid to Vietnam by the U.S. has added up to $3 billion and 14,000 men. Men who are called advisors, but who are in the thick of the battles against the Viet Cong Reds.
As we evolved theories of deterrence, every issue involving security became a military issue, or a potential combat issue, really. And so that much of the energy, the thinking, and the resources in Washington were put on that aspect rather than on diplomatic craft, statecraft, if you wish, the art of which we tended to forget the post-World War II period. And in terms of Vietnam, we see a reflection of that.
Once again, the specter of an expanding communist China inspired military escalation.
These people who say that we ought to withdraw from Vietnam are wholly wrong, because if we withdrew from Vietnam, the communists would control Vietnam. Pretty soon, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Malaya would go, and all of Southeast Asia would be under the control of the communists and under the domination of the Chinese.
Why? Oh, why? Oh, why?
Kennedy and his successor, Lyndon Johnson, were still haunted by the stigma attached to their party over losing China. Johnson vowed he would not undermine his presidency by losing Vietnam. In 1965, he escalated again by sending in regular army forces and heavy bombers.
If this little nation goes down the drain and can't maintain her independence, ask yourself what's going to happen to all the other little nations.
Well, of course, that was a fundamental bit of the jargon of those who were pushing for a larger and larger war, that we couldn't have another China on our hands.
The United States would work hard to drum up regional support for the war.
The men of the 5th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment.
Australia would go all the way with LBJ and send draftees.
Many of those marching are national servicemen, the first conscripted Australians to serve abroad in peacetime. Behind their going lie 2 generations of dispute over conscription, and a country more divided over a war than ever before in our history.
Smaller contingents went from nations such as New Zealand, South Korea, and Singapore.
On New Year's Day, 1965, the foreign minister of China at that time said, "Thailand is next." And I really do think that the leaders in Wellington and Canberra and Singapore and Kuala Lumpur were absolutely correct when they said that, echoed what Lee Kuan Yew said, we're all going to go through the meat grinder. There was nobody who doubted the domino theory at that time.
The remarkable development of supply and service capabilities at Cam Ranh Bay is typical of the U.S. Army logistical buildup throughout South Vietnam.
Vietnam would not only activate U.S. alliances, it would use the entire Pacific Command structure which had been set up to contain the Chinese. Supplies were routed through the naval base in Okinawa. Troops trained in Japan. Up to 50 transport planes a day airlifted provisions from Clark Air Base in the Philippines. Airstrips were constructed, often using Korean and Japanese contractors. 8 major air bases were built in Thailand for B-52 bombing runs over North Vietnam. By the time it was over, the war officially cost $140 billion, and it ended in defeat. In Vietnam, the United States discovered the limits of military power. In 1975, the South Vietnamese army, in which so much had been invested, crumbled before a northern onslaught.
While their officers fired shots into the air, Vietnamese soldiers clawed their way past refugees, journalists, and their own wounded comrades to get on board and away from Xuan Loc.
Many in America would ask why the war had been fought. U.S. economic interests in the region were comparatively small. In 1965, when Johnson sent in troops, U.S. business investment in all Asia was only $2 billion, less than 1.5% of the money eventually spent on the war.
Oh, I don't think military investment and business investment are much related. What was the fear at that time, the vision at that time, was of a rolling wave of communist success. There was no understanding that before you have communism or socialism, you must have something to socialize. Some enterprise to take over. It was a geographic vision. And this had very, very little to do with protecting American business investment. Almost nothing.
The geographic vision had other costs. American deaths in the Korean and Vietnam Wars combined nearly reached the number of Americans killed fighting Japan in World War II. $58,000 American servicemen died in Vietnam alone. South Vietnam lost 250,000 soldiers. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong lost 1 million. Civilian casualties were estimated in the hundreds of thousands.
In those 10 years, you saw not merely an extraordinary burst of economic and social progress throughout the region, but also the beginning of the pulling together of the countries of Southeast Asia and Asia as a whole. And there are those who believe, notably in Asia, that this was a very painful time-buying period that had a lot to do with the emergence of modern Asia.
You let 50,000 of your best people get killed, and you killed several million Vietnamese to get a breathing space? I think that's still nonsense.
Meanwhile, behind the wall of secrecy between China and the West, the Chinese were in the throes of the Cultural Revolution and a bitter split with Moscow. In 1967, the two forces collided as Red Guards attacked the Soviet embassy in Beijing.
The blockade of the Soviet embassy continued for 18 days.
The 170 Russians who remained inside saw Soviet leaders hanged in effigy. The Red Guard mobs lit bonfires and shouted invectives. These pictures from...
Even so, it took another 5 years for the United States to play its China card.
Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China at an appropriate date before May 1972. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure.
I think in the 50s and 60s, American thinking was so fixated on the monolithic nature of communism and on the fact that the communist world was engaged on a crusade against capitalism and American interests, that they did not see the obvious signs of tension that had arisen between these two countries. In retrospect, it is hard to explain how one could overlook the withdrawal of Soviet technicians from China in 1959 and still argue in 1964 that Vietnam was a joint Chinese-Soviet enterprise.
Nixon and Kissinger finally saw the advantage in the biggest domino of all leaning the other way. The cautious friendship based on mutual mistrust of the Soviets reawakened America's old passion for the Chinese.
Oh, we were absolutely swept off our feet when Nixon and Kissinger rediscovered China for us, and China, in its own marvelous way, reciprocated, and from 78, 79 onward, with normalization, Americans were pouring into China, even well before, and Chinese students by that time were pouring into this country. And we had discovered the people who reminded us of ourselves, the Chinese we had loved and lost and now regained.
The values of American democracy and the open door were back on the agenda. In January 1979, Coca-Cola announced it would be selling the real thing in China. It was the first American consumer product in China in 30 years. The Chinese, anxious for technology transfer, opened up factories and joint ventures with Americans and other Western companies, in this case, making pharmaceuticals. Yet the China in which America had again invested so much optimism has again disappointed. 1989's brutal suppression of student protests in Tiananmen Square deeply shocked China's friends.
These tanks have just provided an escort for about 30 troop trucks which have come into Tiananmen Square from the east of the city. Their cannon are covered with cloth, but as usual there's been sporadic machine gun fire.
We should live peacefully. We don't want the army. We don't want the gunshots and the fire. You know, army firing at the innocent people.
What happened in Tiananmen was the high tide of yet another peaking of romanticism, because not only were the Chinese the ones we dealt with for the past 10 years, they were fresh student faces who were acting like promoters of the great China we've always yearned for, the China that Sun Yat-sen might have given us, Jeffersonian tutees, democracy advocates, the statue of the goddess of democracy, and then the big crackdown. Well, all I'm saying is we were jilted again. Our hopes were too high.
John Peyton Davies once called China a huge, seductive, practical joke. The culture that has resisted American missionaries, traders, reformers, and Democrats alike. Ironically, another Asian culture has proved a much better apprentice. Japan, the nation with whom Americans fought a total war, has been a keen student of American capitalism. The real winner of the Cold War in Asia was neither of the protagonists. Instead, America's military encirclement of China created the climate for Japan's economic rebirth. In the next part of Power in the Pacific is Japan's story, how a nation overcame humiliation and defeat, and how it used the Cold War to win the trade war.
Funding for Power in the Pacific was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the financial support of viewers like you.